Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start off this program with a question that had to do with research findings. As we have a lot of programming mentioning research, what's the average guy supposed to think about some of these statements about research that we're always getting? Well, the average guy needs to trust his instincts a little bit, because every now and then we hear some things that are pretty sad. And good scientific technique is to be skeptical. And if you have a healthy skepticism, that makes for good research. Unfortunately, sometimes the media picks up certain words and takes things out of context. I heard one this morning that completely reversed the actual findings of some research. We hear a great deal about the polls. These polls are always taken. Well, unless you know who took it and what the actual wording is, the poll may not really represent what people think. There are very scientific methods how to do polling and to get an accurate representation of the general population. But still, you have to know what the wording of the questions are before you can really understand what that's about. Here's another question. Came up recently. It says, is there any special way that families are supposed to treat people who are in the hospital? The sick patient role. What is it? Well, interestingly, in study of sociology, the role of the sick patient has been named and it's been labeled. And you think about it. You visit somebody in the hospital, the person's supposed to be sick, supposed to feel sick, supposed to say words to indicate that there is an illness, a disability, an incapacity. Certain way the person is supposed to talk so that there is a dependency on others. In other words, having given up certain freedoms and rights while in the hospital. But not too much. None of us like to visit somebody in a hospital who complains too much. They're supposed to hurt, but not complain about it very much. We're supposed to feel that somehow the person is able to treat us. Now, the family is supposed to respond, to relate, to reciprocate, to be willing to be helpful, to be sympathetic. Very specific kinds of patterns go on in hospitals. That used to be, I think, much worse than it is now, before patients' rights came into being. It used to be that there was a hierarchy in the hospital. In fact, there's a book published several years ago that studied human relations in Southern Hospital, I believe was the name of the book. And it was a study of what goes on in hospitals. The patient was on the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak, and everybody else was over the patient. Excuse me. In other words, the aide who came in to change the water has more authority than the patient. The Veterans Administration hospitals used to accentuate that a great deal, making a difference. What was wrong with you? In some hospitals, if you went in as a patient, the first thing they did was take your clothes away and put a bathrobe on you. So everybody in the bathrobe was at the bottom of the pile. You had no authority. In other words, it could have been a general in the military before, it could have been a private. Bathrobes equalized everybody. So the patient in the hospital has an interesting role to play. You go in now and everybody's in charge except the patient. Well, next time you're in a hospital, look around and see if you see that sort of thing. I think it's interesting. Here's another question. It says, when my children have temper tantrums, what should I do? Well, I think 3 magic words. I've mentioned those 3 magic words from time to time on this program. I call them magic words because they're the words that parents need to keep in mind. Firm, consistent kindness. Most time children learn when and how long to have a temper tantrum. Certain places, they learn the length that it's going to be tolerated. They learn what they can get by with. That's perfectly normal, perfectly natural for children to try to test the limits. All of us try to test the limits, see what we can get by with. Temper tantrums sometimes are just that. They're statements by a child that says, I want to be recognized, or I want to have my say, I want to have my authority, or I don't agree with you. Temper tantrum may say a lot of different things. You have to just look at it a little bit. You know, as an outsider, watching families interact with children having temper tantrums, it's much easier than being a member of the family and one of my own children. Except my children didn't have very many temper tantrums. Well, they had other faults, but temper tantrums was not particularly acceptable. And we have to remember that sometimes what the child is really asking is to love me, just to love me. I don't know what to do. I don't know how I'm supposed to behave. And so because I don't know, I'm just bubbling over and showing all this aggression and anger, and somebody around here show that I'm somebody. Care about me a little bit. We have to remember, I think it's well to remember, that we need love most when we're most unlovable. It's an expression that I ran across, and I don't know who the author of it is, but I think it applies to a lot of different things. Here's another point about children. A question came up. It says, I hear children talk about being bored, and I don't recall hearing that when I was a child. Have children changed? That is an expression that I hear and have heard a lot the last couple of decades. 20 years, or maybe even 30 years ago, I think was the first time that I ever heard a child talk about being bored. It struck me as odd at the time because I'd never thought about children being bored. I wondered what the situation is, what causes it. I know there's some good answers out there, but right now my best answer is that they're probably overstimulated with video, media, television, that sort of thing. And so they get used to thinking, well, if something goes on, I don't like it, just change channels. And if there's not a video or something going on to entertain them, then the expression about boredom comes up. My recommended solution for that is to teach them to read. I think a child who really is into reading is never bored. You watch the child's imagination. If the child can really read and enjoy the reading, learn to enjoy reading, see, there are no limits to the imagination. Have you ever watched a child open presents, Christmas, birthday, that sort of thing? Sometimes small children play with the boxes rather than the toys. What does that really mean? We're looking at a child's using the imagination. I remember a friend of mine who was really, I think, spoiling a child, used to buy all sorts of things. And he was concerned one day, he came to work saying, I don't understand it. I bought these toys for my child, and what did he do? He was playing with the boxes. He didn't pay any attention to the toys. Well, imagination at work in a child is something really interesting to observe. And if you can sort of identify with it, see where it goes, there is no limit. So notice it next time. About children who are bored, maybe it's just a popular expression. I'm not sure, but the child who's bored, he hasn't been using his imagination. Well, here's another question that's come in, changing topics over to wife, husband. This one says, my wife is so dependent on me, I'm not comfortable. She seems so helpless, yet I find myself getting angry. What can I do? Well, Sometimes helplessness and dependency is a way of controlling other people. We used to have expression in the psychiatric terminology about passive-aggressive, passive-dependent. There are such things as passive personalities, dependent personalities. These are people who sometimes are controlling their environment through their passivity. And if you're totally dependent on somebody, you're controlling somebody else. Sometimes it's an expression that says, I want to be loved, I want to be cared for. Sometimes it's an expression that says, I'm controlling you. I'm managing your life through my dependency. And if you don't do what I want you to, then of course you don't care about me. Sometimes there are all sorts of messages. We're not really sure what the message is. Now, from an outsider standpoint, I would approach that and say, what is the benefit to the person? What does the person receive by being dependent? Some people are habitually dependent. They ask for other people's opinions constantly. They tend to lean on other people. Well, ask the question, what does that do for the person? The person is manipulating. You may find that, well, some people have an ego problem and they don't want to be dependent. Other people seem to be overly dependent. Yet it may be basically the same thing. What's the benefit? What does the person get out of it? What does it cost the person? Well, that's sort of related to the next item. It says, a few years ago, Games People Play, that was the name of a book. It was a popular book, and are people still playing games? We don't hear about them much anymore. Yes, people are still playing games. What kind of games? Well, one we've just mentioned about the dependency. Here's the name of a game. It says, see what you made me do. The person is typically and habitually putting other people in the role of being responsible, and then the person who's playing the game, see, is not responsible for whatever goes wrong, can blame the other person. See what you made me do. Another game is Now I've Got You. People manipulate, put somebody else in a particular role. There are games where people seem to attract hostility, anger. It's called Kick Me, Punish Me. There's a game that people play that was at one time called I'm Always Late. People go around saying, well, I'm always late. And sometimes that irritates people who like to be on time. You watch people manipulate and control their environment by being late. Another game is What Do You Think? And the yes, but. They go together. Somebody's always asking opinions, but they're asking opinions just for the purpose of contradicting them, taking another one. Then there's a game that comes along that's called Uproar, where people get into the pattern of escalating anger and fights. You see some couples do this consistently. They start with a mild conversation, and it gets louder and louder and louder, and they seem to follow a pattern. With all of these games, whatever they may be, typically somebody's manipulating. Sometimes they're going together. Sometimes a person is passing responsibility and refusing to be responsible. It's a control mechanism. They're not anything new. You can read about people's behavior going on like this, so somebody came along in the 20th century and wrote a book about it. But they've been written these things have been written up in literature for centuries. Human nature doesn't seem to have changed. Sometimes a game is just a way of getting attention. Sometimes a game is a way of avoiding responsibility. Look at it. And you see what people are doing. Sometimes it's interesting and you can stop it. You don't have to play into it. Probably the worst game that people can play is called, some people call it a corner game, where you put people in a corner. Most often I refer to it as putting people in a double bind, where either way they go, they're wrong. Whatever the person tries to do is going to be wrong. Whether it's whatever you call it, doesn't matter. I think everybody would recognize being put in a situation where, well, I'm in a no-win situation, lose-lose situation. That's devastating, because when people feel that they're in a lose-lose situation, they get angry. They get frustrated. They don't know what to do. If you can't win whatever you do, what do you do? Well, my suggestion, if you ever get in that situation, and I'm sure anybody will, and everybody does from time to time, but to recognize it and relate to it directly. Say to the person, well, you put me in a no-win situation, and since I'm going to assume that you didn't do that intentionally, I just can't go along with your two options. I don't like them. I can't win. So I have to pick my own, something else. Pick up the horns of the dilemma. Relate to one. Get out of it. Don't stay in a no-win situation. It's going to be devastating. I think you'll find it's easier to recognize than most people think. Once you stop to think about it, you start feeling uncomfortable, let it be a trigger to you and say, wait a minute, why do I feel uncomfortable? And you may recognize it. Then you're in a no-win situation. I found out one time doing research with about 600 people. It's not a big research project, but about 600 people. I found out that they couldn't make up no-win situations on the spur of the moment. And most people just couldn't do it. I came to the conclusion that people don't do that intentionally. And it's something that happens to people the way they're thinking. And it seems to follow patterns. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello. I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start off today, something that a lot of people are very familiar with. The question was, how can I stop worrying? How can I stop worrying? How many times have you asked that question? Well, first, I tell people, well, maybe you shouldn't try to stop. That surprises most people. Why should you stop worrying if worrying is important, worrying is essential? Maybe you find that you're not worrying about the right things, or you're spending too much time worrying about things over which you have no control. Oh yes, I'm familiar with it, that we know that worrying never solved any problems. However, let's look at it. Actually, worrying is essential. Some anxiety is essential. We don't get along well. In fact, we probably wouldn't even live very long if we didn't have some anxiety. So, I don't try to get people to stop worrying altogether. What I'd rather they do is to worry by the clock, and I prescribe worrying by the clock in this way. Pick out a good time of the day that you'll be perfectly free to concentrate on the topic. Perfectly free to concentrate. Whatever time of day it is. Take 15 minutes. You can probably find it. 3 a.m.? Okay. Midnight? 5 p.m.? Whatever kind of time of day that you know you're going to have time. Set it aside as your worrying time. And every time you thought about, you think about worrying through the day, think about, well, I will worry about that at my designated time. I worry about that when I can really concentrate. See, most people don't worry efficiently. They're very ineffective in worrying. They're sloppy. They mess it up. They can't concentrate. They're thinking about other things. They're supposed to be doing something else, and the worry comes in and gets in their way. So they don't do a good job. So why not set aside a time when you can really concentrate? Put on the Dristan expression, get your Excedrin headache going, do the whole thing. Concentrate on worrying about those things that most concern you. And if you'll do it regularly, doesn't have to be every day. Depends on how many worries you have. Some people need it. Some people don't. Some people can get by with worrying every other day or every 3 days. But to set aside a time, say, okay, this is my worry time. And I'm going to worry about things properly, and I'm going to be efficient about it. I'm not going to let something distract me. I'm going to worry about this topic. You know what happens? When that time comes around, I found that so many times people can't even recall what they were supposed to worry about. So I suggest, well, write it down. Make a list of the things you're going to worry about later, but not now. So as soon as something comes up and starts bothering you, make a note, and worry about it at whatever, 5 a.m. or whatever your time is that you designate. The efficacy, the efficiency of worrying isn't very good unless you really plan to do it right. There are other ways of cutting down on worrying time is when you start thinking about worrying about something, get up and do something physical. It very quickly then shifts attention. Start doing something physical. I think the military had this in mind. It used to tell people, I recall stories about it, perhaps some of the viewers can recall. The Army used to say, well, paint it. Anything you can't move, paint it. Keep busy. Whatever you're doing, keep busy. What was the purpose in that? It's to keep people from worrying and developing anxiety. Keep busy, keep doing something even if it's wrong. I've heard that in the military. Unfortunately, we don't limit it to the military. There's another way of approaching worry. What would you be like if you didn't have your worries? Do you really want to change, or do you enjoy worrying about things? Now, some people seem to really enjoy being miserable. See, so underneath they're really not miserable, they just enjoy acting like it. But I often have asked people in counseling, therapy sessions, to try to imagine how they would be without the problem. What would your life be like? How would you be acting without this particular problem? And sometimes people are a little afraid to even think about it. They'd rather have the problem. Now that I've had a few years under my belt and doing this sort of work, I sometimes ask people, are you ready to get rid of this problem? Or do you want to keep it around a while longer? To try to get people to focus on it. I've had people want to set up long-term counseling sessions, long-term psychotherapy, to keep talking about the problem. Well, it was benefiting them to talk about it, but it really perhaps wasn't helping in other ways. People who really didn't want to get rid of it. Well, so much for worrying today. Here's another one. It says, my neighbor has a dog that seems to be more important than their children. Well, it's an interesting neighbor who makes that observation, isn't it? But says, what do I think? I think it's sad. There are people, though, who don't trust other people. They'd rather try to trust an animal, man's best friend and that sort of thing. Cats are always loyal, I've heard that. Dogs are loyal regardless how you feel. Well, actually, dogs and cats, those animals that are considered domestic animals, sometimes take on the behavior of the owners. And they seem to worry. If you keep a dog long enough, it gets to look like you, or you get to look like the dog. Well, actually, the behavior is that way. But unfortunately, there are people who really don't feel comfortable with other people, and so they want pets. And pets serve a very good purpose. It's been found in all sorts of projects and studies about how pets can benefit people. But to put a pet before a child, if one has children, I think that's sad. Here's another question that came up in a conversation the other day. It says, what's your opinion of the recent, it takes a community to rear a child? Well, some of you recognize that as a book. I think it's a political expression. I think it's sad. I don't agree with it. I think it's an expression that has so much political overtones that basically what it's saying is we don't need families. It takes a community. Way back when I was a young sociology student, if you can ever imagine being a young man, but in sociology we found that there were closed families and open societies, and closed societies and open families. Studying families all over the world and throughout history, we found that it appears that family structure and children need the security of a closed unit. So if the family is open, there needs to be a protective society around it. It's closed. If the society is open, then the family has to be closed. There has to be integrity. And to say that it takes community to raise a child, I don't agree. I think it's sort of an anti-family movement. There used to be anti-family movements. In fact, some of you have heard of the Kibbutz of Israel. Well, in 1890, there was an anti-family Zionist group, the Kibbutz, which was anti-family. What they wanted to do was to set up a system that was separate from the family, to show that families weren't needed, so that people wouldn't be locked in to a family unit. Well, the kibbutz never did really succeed as far as the numbers go. I think about 5% of the people in that particular society. But they didn't work. There have been other experiments in different societies in this century that have tried to replace the family. One of them was the communist, 1917, and some of the social movements that the Communist Party set up in the late teens and in the 1920s were very specifically anti-family. So that the family unit was not considered to be efficient. It was wasteful of energy of people's time and labor. And so they set up organized child care centers, youth centers to take over children, community kitchens. They thought a woman working in a kitchen cooking for one family was very inefficient. Well, it was found in the communist countries in the late 30s. Communists found by that time that it didn't work. It wasn't working. So the Communist Party reversed itself and said the family is second only to the party, Communist Party, of course. And the Nazis also tried a hand at doing away with the family. And those things just don't seem to work. What the child needs is a loving, caring, supporting, secure family. Regardless, that seems to be true in history. Well, here's another one. Young lady said, my mother's an alcoholic. What can I do? And the young lady approached me with that question. My first thought was, why not get your father to join you in your question? Get your father and the two of you work together and have a conference with your mother. That sounds easy. Expect your mother to do certain things. If you expect it in advance, you won't be disappointed or particularly surprised, and maybe you can deal with it better. Expect your mother to resist. Expect your mother to be tearful, resentful, remorseful, but don't expect her to change a great deal. Alcoholics don't change rapidly as a group. They seem to be pretty resistant. And here's what's also important to keep in mind, that in spite of all kinds of treatments that have been tried, Most of the treatments come out to be about the same level of success, to have the same level of success. AA works well for some people, but not the majority. Individual counseling works well for some, but not much better, if any better than AA. Long-term counseling, group counseling, none of them have a high rate of success. I've been in this business a long while. I've tried most of them. I've worked a lot with the addictive personalities, people who've been on drugs and alcohol. And what people do is they change themselves more than anything else. A person who is an alcoholic, first, what is an alcoholic? Get your definitions right. Be consistent with your definitions. Your definition doesn't have to fit mine, but be consistent. Some people say that an alcoholic is a person who, after the first drink, has no control. Somebody else will come along and say an alcoholic is a person who drinks so much over a period of time, a quantity. Somebody else will come along, and it's the one I favor, says that an alcoholic is someone who drinks enough that it interferes significantly with one or more areas of the person's life. If that's true, it doesn't matter when the person drinks or how much the person drinks. If the person drinks enough to interfere significantly with one or more areas of the person's life, such as the marriage, the family, the work, social adjustment, one or more areas, then that person in my book has an alcohol problem and would be considered, the way I define it, as an alcoholic. That doesn't mean the person is totally helpless, because most people aren't. They pick and choose when they drink. The 12-step program of AA is a good program, but there are some people, and there are a lot of people, who can never make that first step and admit being powerless over alcohol. And what happens to these people? Well, they still struggle, and they try to do the best they can. And the idea, though, is that any treatment seems to help some. But be realistic. What do you want people to do? You want them to quit drinking, or you want them just to cut down? You want them to just stop making a nuisance of themselves, quit being a problem, quit being a bother? Or you want the person to try to quit altogether? Some people have an ego problem about quitting altogether. They don't seem to be able to restrain themselves enough. And they make social drinkers. Long-term studies, I believe Harvard Review had something on this, a Harvard mental health letter recently, talking about what happens to alcoholics. Most of them become basically social drinkers over time. In other words, people don't really give up drinking. They just learn to control their drinking a little more, and most of it within social limits. People who are really very heavy into drinking, what do? They wind up killing themselves in a car wreck or something like that, dying of something else. Illness related to the alcohol abuse. They don't have a long life expectancy. So most people turn out to be social drinkers. And I think there is a certain percentage of people, Henry Brill was a specialist on this one time, came to visit here, had him on video programs, and his research said that 5% of the people have a hereditary problem. They are alcoholics with their first drink. In other words, the body, if it never gets alcohol, the person is not an alcoholic. But once the chemistry is changed by ingesting alcohol, then it sets off, it triggers the mechanism. The person is an alcoholic from then on. So maybe I answered the girl's question about what to do with her mother. Same answer about the father. The father was an alcoholic. been known for many years that women are not as open in their alcoholism as men are. It used to be that women stayed home and were home drinkers, closet drinkers, but the percentage was about the same. In other words, there were many more women at home who were abusing alcohol, many more men out in the community abusing alcohol. So the time passes. And until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Welcome back. Start off today with a question: what's the difference between pornography and eroticism? Well, interesting question, isn't it? Pornography is illicit eroticism. Eroticism is something that's sexually stimulating. Pornography is something that's sexually stimulating, but it has to be illicit. Look in the unabridged dictionary, find definition for that. Here's what I've found about pornography, that typically the themes are against society. There's something about it, it's illicit. It makes a specific point, fancy word, iconoclastic. It goes against certain norms of society. It's sexually stimulating, it is erotic, or it doesn't qualify for the definition. But for the reason that it's illicit, people get tired of eroticism and the same thing all the time, so it keep changing the themes. I recall some local judges and others have gotten into discussions, even in grand jury and reports on pornography, that they had trouble coming up with definitions. I never did understand why they had trouble. Look in the dictionary. I thought that was a simple approach. Here's a question. Comes up from time to time, but should couples take separate vacations? And my answer, quick answer, is no, only if they want to. But some relationships can't stand the stress and can't stand the tension that a separate vacation would impose. Others, other people, other relationships, maybe they need a little separation time. It depends on the purpose. So the security, people feel the comfort that is felt, whether or not the person feels comfortable within himself or herself. So the answer is why? Why should people take separate vacations, or why shouldn't they? And that has to be answered really with the couple. Some can, some should, some can't, some shouldn't try. So it depends on the individuals, really. I don't think there is a good sweeping answer and say, yes, everybody should have separate vacation, or no, no one should have separate vacation. Here's another question. It says, what kind of families take stress best? Tensions. Excuse me. I remember a book called Tornadoes Over Texas. I think Harry Moore was the author. He was a sociologist. And what he was doing was running into tornadoes. You know, we've seen a lot of things on weather studies lately about people chasing tornadoes to study and try to learn how they form, what happens to them. Well, this man was a sociologist, and what he did, he would run into areas where tornadoes had just happened and study families and what families did, what they did to try to cope with the problems, what the families would do to try to reintegrate themselves. And what he found was that authoritative families cope best with stress. Families that have an organization, families that have a head, families that have designated roles, in other words, the father does this, the mother does that, these were the families that seemed to cope best with stress. Some families are so loosely organized that whatever comes along upsets them, and maybe some people have it deliberately that way. They don't want to have structure in their everyday life. They don't want to be confined or restricted, so they set up deliberately loose organization. Well, those families don't seem to withstand stress and tensions. You know, that's what the people want. Things get heavy, they just pick the bag and go somewhere else. They move along. So the lack of structure is a facilitator sometimes for breaking up the family. Here's another question. Says, at what age should sex education start? Well, by the time you think of it as a parent, it's already started. It's an interesting thing. Sex education shouldn't be a particular course of study. It's not a curriculum. It's not something that has a beginning or an end. When a child first learns that it is a boy or a girl, sex education is already well underway. Seriously. The attitudes, the opinions, the behavior of the parents, the brothers, sisters. I think the quicker that parents recognize that sex education is ongoing and is all along the child's life, I think the less anxiety that parents will have. Too many parents get very uptight about this, thinking, ooh, what am I going to tell my child about where the babies come from? Well, that's only a tiny, tiny part of sex education. Why not just tell the youngster the truth? Simple thing. Tell it to them on the basis of the child's age. You don't tell the child more than it can understand. You don't tell the child something that's going to be provocative. But you try to answer the question factually. But you're already answering questions before the child ever learns to talk. You're answering questions by how you act as a man, as a woman. That's part of sex education. It always has been and always will be. Parents are the primary educators. I really don't think schools ought to have much to do with it, frankly, about sex education. Schools pick up age 5. Personality is pretty well formed by age 5. So what are we trying to impose on the school? And sometimes, if you've seen the students, and most of you have, students who go to college try to learn to be teachers, some of them I wouldn't want wanting to try to teach my children about sex education. Here's another question. It says, with so many people living together outside of marriage, what's the purpose of marriage preparation courses such as pre-Cana, things like that? Well, any training, any orientation is better than none. That's been found. If people prepare themselves for family life, they're going to be better at it than somebody who has no exposure. So yes, I'm still in favor of people going through marriage preparation, family life preparation, orientation. Sometimes, for some people, that's the first time they've ever thought about it. It is very sad, in my opinion. Very sad how many people present themselves at things like that, such as a pre-Cana, who are already living together. What percentage? 3 out of 4. In some places it's said to be 9 out of 10. People have the honeymoon first and then they decide to get married. Speaking of marriage, here's another question. Problem comes up and says, what in your experience is the most common problem in marriage? Answer is, I've answered it before in this program, is a violation of marriage vows. I've never found a problem in marriage that hasn't been a violation of the marriage vows. Simple. People promise to love. Think how inclusive that is. To cherish, to treat as valuable, to honor, to treat with respect. That takes most problems right there. Just those 3. Most of the problems are not related to extramarital affairs. Forsaking all others, in sickness and in health, for rich or for poor, for better or for worse, until death do us part. Now, you don't have to get into all the rest of it. Most of the time, people don't have problems with sickness and in health. Here's a question that's related. It said, what's wrong with marriage today? I have this question kicked up pretty often doing marriage preparation. The answer is simple. Nothing's wrong with marriage. There's quite a bit wrong with the people who want to get married, though. The problems in marriage are with the people, not what marriage is. People in marriage, they want to change things to fit themselves. They want to change the rules, the format, what's expected, the purposes. Then they say, oh, marriage is something wrong with it. Somewhat on a similar note, the question comes in, are divorces going up or down today? Well, the numbers of divorces, they're going down. And until you start looking at a rate, the number of people who get married is going down, and so the number of divorces, in that sense, a rate is going down. Divorces per unit married. Most people today, I said a while ago, perhaps are even avoiding marriage. Some of them are avoiding marriage, so they're avoiding divorce. That reminds me, in the 1960s, in the mid-60s, I was doing research in Florida and Georgia on this topic. Marriage vows, marriage continuity, what goes on in family life. I had a questionnaire that I was going around and asking high school seniors, different schools. I would give a questionnaire to all the seniors in high schools, different states there. And this is what I found. I had to revise my questionnaire. The blacks, they were called Negroes at the time, the Negro did not understand the word divorce. One of the questions says, has your mother or father been divorced? They didn't know what that was. These were average intelligence, average students in high school, whatever they were. Some above, some below, but most of them just average folks. I had to change the question and say, how many husbands has your mother had? How many wives has your father had? People could relate to that. Because I found then, it was sort of a little serendipity, unexpected finding. I found that in most counties of Florida and Georgia, at that time, there had never been a divorce. Negroes divorcing Negroes, or blacks divorcing blacks. There had never been a divorce. So there were a lot of marriages, but no divorces. It was quite surprising. And I made a prediction then. That seemed to me what was happening to the white folks. I think it has. I think it's been happening. It is happening. And we've been watching it happen. As I mentioned on this program before, sometimes today we're seeing really serious questions and problems with children where one of the parents moves out and goes to live with somebody else, and somebody else comes to live with a parent that stays at the home. And so mother's boyfriend and father's girlfriend, and sometimes it is father's boyfriend and mother's girlfriend, but that's devastating for the children. Speaking of children, here's a question. It says, do children today really have anything to do? We seem to provide everything for them. Yes, children actually have the same things to do today as they've had for the last several generations. They have basically 6 life tasks. Sexual identity, boy or girl, learn how to adjust as a boy or girl. Learn how society adjusts to the person as a boy or girl. Another one is being a student. Now, most kids go to school and they're expected to go to school. Well, learning the life task of how to be a student, how to relate, how to learn, what to do with the learning, to acquire knowledge and how to use that knowledge. That's a task, a life task for every child. Another one is to develop a self-concept and self-esteem. Of course, these threads go all the way through all areas of life, but as a specific kind of task, yes, to learn how to relate to oneself. I'm so tall, I'm so wide, and so thick, and my eyes are this close together, this far apart. Well, who am I? What do I see in myself? To learn my own limitations. Maybe I'm not the fastest kid on the block. Maybe I'm slow. But maybe I have something else, some other talent, some other skill. Learning to put myself in society. That's a task for a child, and it's ongoing. It keeps on going. There's another task of learning about family, friends, and community. Who am I in reference to if I'm a child here, in reference to my neighbors? In the community here, what am I supposed to do, if anything? How do I relate to this community? Another task is work, career, job. Trying to learn and to find out, what am I going to do? Am I just going to grow up and find a job, any kind of job? Or do I want a career? What kind of career? Do I want to be identified with what kind of work I do in order to support myself? Do I intend to support myself as a child growing up? Do I have that goal in mind, is to eventually to learn how to support myself? How do I get along doing things like that? Well, that's part of the life task that every child's supposed to go into. There's another one. That's the spiritual side. Some people call it the existential side. But the spiritual side, who am I in terms of religions? Do I have a spiritual side? Do I have a spiritual dimension? Well, I think everybody does. Some people deny it, but I think everybody does. So these 6 points or 6 corners of people's life, these are life tasks that every child has to meet one way or the other. Now, how well the child can meet them, how well are they prepared? How do you prepare children to meet these things? See, often we as parents just sort of say, well, all you have to do is feed and fan a child, keep them clean, they just grow up, as if the child doesn't have anything to do. No, children have a lot to do, actually. They have specific life tasks to learn. We as parents and as grandparents and as great-grandparents, when we are around our families, we should be able to try to assist the children in learning. And all of these 6 elements flow into one another. They're not separate, distinct parts. In other words, my spiritual being is within my own body, my intellectual self. I'm part of that as a career person or not. That's the way things are. Children today have a lot to do, and they need to get on doing it. And I watch them in the mall sometimes. On occasion, I go to the mall. Every now and then I go shopping. Not often. I don't particularly like to shop. But I see something different down there, as all of you have seen. These groups of teenagers, some of them very young, acting as if they don't have anything to do, and that's the best place for them. Well, that's not a criticism of the mall, but I'm wondering, why aren't they getting on with their life? They seem to be finding a place simply to kill time. And maybe that's not the best thing to do. Used to be, and we were told about how we shouldn't just kill time. But until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one.